The crystal trees of Zephyra are about as inviting as a tax audit from Galactic Authority, sharp, cold, and likely to leave you crying in a corner. Captain Maley stood at the viewport of the Endeavor, squinting at the glittering nightmare stretching across the horizon. "You ever seen anything so beautiful it'd probably kill you if you touched it?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. Lead engineer Verrill snorted from his spot under the console, where a nest of sparking wires hissed like angry snakes. "Yeah, my last girlfriend. Only she had less personality than these trees." He tugged a wire, and the lights flickered ominously. "Speaking of deadly beauty, you sure we should be hanging around this place?" Maley shrugged, a motion as casual as a shrug can be when you're also mentally calculating the odds of being speared by a stray crystal branch. "What's the worst that could happen? We crash, die horribly, and they name a crater after us." "I was thinking more along the lines of being haunted by a ghost." Verrill emerged from beneath the console, looking like he'd had a close encounter with a particularly aggressive toaster. His hair stood in wild tufts, and his overalls were smudged with something that looked suspiciously like alien slime. Maley's raised an eyebrow. "A ghost, huh? What are we, a bunch of superstitious ancients? Next you'll tell me we should sacrifice a goat to the gods of interstellar travel." Verrill shrugged, wiping his hands on a rag that might have once been a shirt. "Hey, all I'm saying is that ever since we parked here, I've been having dreams. Weird ones. Like floating out in space without a suit, kind of weird." "That's just your subconscious telling you to stop eating those synth burgers before bed." Maley's waved him off, but her mind was already turning the possibility over like a shiny rock. Dreams were one thing, but everyone on board had reported similar nocturnal hallucinations since they'd landed. Dreams of a presence just outside the ship, a cold whispering that gnawed at the edges of their sanity. "Fine, dismiss my prophetic visions, but don't come crying to me when we all end up possessed by some ancient Zephyra spirit." Verrill rolled his eyes, which only made him look more like he'd stuck his finger in a power socket. The comms console crackled to life, spitting static like a drunk uncle at a wedding. "Captain, you better get up here," came the voice of Arlies, the navigation officer with the demeanor of a caffeinated squirt. "Something's happening in the forest, and by something I mean everything's glowing." Maley sighed, the kind of weary exhalation one would expect from someone who just discovered their favorite brand of coffee had been discontinued. "Of course it is," she muttered, heading for the bridge. "Because why not? Glowing forests at midnight. Just what I needed to add some spice to my day." The bridge of the Endeavor was a cramped affair, full of blinking lights, tangled cables, and the faint smell of fried circuits. Arlies was hunched over her console, eyes glued to the screens as if expecting them to sprout legs and run away. "See," she said, pointing at the viewport. Outside, the crystalline forest shimmered with an eerie, phosphorescent light. It was the kind of glow that made you double-check your insurance policy for alien-induced blindness coverage. "Well, that's unsettling," Maley said, crossing her arms. "Any idea why our delightful tree friends have decided to become night lights?" Arlies shrugged, and Verrill muttered something unprintable about cosmic mysteries and his inability to find a decent cup of coffee on this rust bucket. "Sensors are picking up some kind of energy surge," Arlies replied, tapping the screen as though that would make it cough up answers. "Off the charts, actually. Fantastic." Maley's pinched the bridge of her nose, trying to stave off the headache developing behind her eyes. "So what do? Sit here and wait for the after-school special about respecting alien ecosystems?" Verrill scratched his chin, his face a study in thoughtful chaos. "We could try sending a drone out, see if it gets spooked by any ghosts. Or," Arlies chimed in, her tone as sugary as a synthetic sweetener, "we could sit tight and hope that whatever's out there doesn't feel like coming in here." "And miss the chance to poke a glowy tree with a stick," Maley's grinned, darkly amused at the absurdity of it all. "Let's send the drone. Might as well see if it's allergic to crystal sap or whatever." The preparation of the drone was a hurried affair, a flurry of activity that involved a lot of swearing and the occasional sound of something important being dropped. Veril fiddled with the controls, his tongue stuck out in concentration, while Arlies muttered a string of reassurance to the computer systems. "If it explodes," Mealy said, watching the drone with the same wariness one might reserve for a rabid dog, "I want it on record that I told you this was a bad idea." The drone shot out of the Endeavor like a bat out of hell, its sensors drinking in the night air. The screens in the bridge lit up with data, streams of information that might as well have been written in ancient Martian for all Mealy's could decipher. "Look at that," Veril said, twiddling the controls like an old pro. "The trees are emitting some kind of field, wavelengths I've never seen before, like they're communicating." "Great," Mealy said deadpan. "Tree telepathy, just what I needed on my resume." Veril gave her a sideways look, the kind you give someone right before telling them their fly's open. "I'm serious, Captain. There's something out there. I can feel it. And what if it's not friendly?" Arlies piped up, her eyes bright with the thrill of potential doom. "What if it's less welcome weary travelers and more hay, fresh meat?" "Then I hope it likes its meat seasoned with sarcasm and regret," Mealy's replied with a smirk. "Keep that drone moving. Let's see if we can get a clearer picture of what's going on out there before it decides we're a snack." As the drone continued its exploration, Mealy's felt a chill creep down her spine. The kind that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the unsettling sensation of being watched. The screens flickered, and the lights on the bridge dimmed for a split second. It was enough to have everyone holding their breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Please tell me that was just a power fluctuation," Mealy said, her voice a tight coil of forced calm. Veril shook his head, eyes glued to the console. "Nope, that was something else. Something that's probably about to make our lives a lot more complicated." And then, as if on cue, the drone's feed went haywire. Static danced across the screens and a high-pitched whine filled the air. "Lost it," Arlies announced, a mix of disappointment and resignation in her voice. "Something out there fried the systems." "Or someone," Veril added, his tone dripping with foreboding. "Guess we're not alone after all." Mealy sighed, looking out at the forest with a newfound respect for its otherworldly menace. "All right, team. Looks like we're in for a haunted night. Let's just hope we make it to morning without becoming ghost stories ourselves." The crew exchanged glances, the mixture of fear and excitement palpable in the air. With the drone down and the forest glowing like a cosmic disco ball, one thing was certain. Whatever was out there in the crystalline depths of Zephyra was about to make its move. The Endeavor's crew was no stranger to chaos, but this was the kind that promised to stick around like a bad hangover. Captain Mealy's leaned against the bridge's bulkhead, watching the crystalline forest outside with the same wary interest one might reserve for a live grenade in a toy shop. "Well, if this doesn't scream bad idea, I don't know what does," she muttered, half to herself, half to the universe at large. Arlies, ever the picture of caffeinated anxiety, busied herself with the navigation console. "I'm telling you, Captain, those trees are planning something, probably involving our untimely demise." Her fingers danced across the keys, trying to coax coherence from the static-riddled screens. "Trees with murderous intent," Mealy's chuckled dryly. "That's a new one." "What do they do?" Russell menacingly. "More like glow ominously until your brain implodes," Arlies retorted, her eyes a little too wide, a little too bright. "Seriously, though, something's messing with us, and it ain't just the trees." Veril, who'd been staring at his console like it owed him money, piped up. "Speaking of messed up things, I found something in the system logs. A trail of data crumbs that smells fishier than Arlies' cooking." "Hey," Arlies protested, though she didn't exactly deny it. "A trail of what now?" Mealy's asked, intrigued despite herself. "Data anomalies," Veril replied, pointing to a series of numbers that probably meant something to someone who actually understood math. "They suggest a presence within our systems, like a consciousness. But not one from our crew." "So what?" Mealy's folded her arms, skepticism in her expression. "You're saying we've got a ghost in the machine, or a really advanced hacker with a sense of humor, Varel shrugged. Either way, it's not friendly. It's been poking around since we landed. Could be connected to those dreams everyone's been having. Perfect, Maylee sighed, the sarcasm practically dripping from her words. Not only are we stuck on a haunted planet, but our ship's haunted too. Maybe we should call in a priest. Know any good ones who work interstellar gigs? Varel shook his head, eyes focused on the screen as if willing it to make more sense. There's more. Whatever it is, it's sending signals, like it's trying to communicate or reach out. Reach out and touch someone, Arlies quipped, nervously chewing on the end of her pencil. Preferably not us, thanks. Maylee's considered the information, her brain churning through possibilities like a rusty processor. So how do we deal with it? Can you kick it out? Maybe threaten it with eternal damnation or something. Varel snorted, a dry laugh escaping his lips. If only it were that simple. Whatever this thing is, it's smart. It shifts and hides like it's playing a damn game of hide and seek. Well, I hope it's enjoying itself, Maylee said with a grim smile. Because if it makes my life any harder, I'm going to find a way to exercise the hell out of it, using brute force if necessary. Arlies looked up from her console, concern creasing her brow. What if it's not just fun and games? What if this thing's dangerous? With our luck, Maylee sighed. Of course it's dangerous, wouldn't be here if it wasn't. As the crew bantered, the tension on the bridge felt like a coiled spring ready to snap. The forest outside pulsed with an unsettling glow, the kind that made you want to check for hidden traps under your bed at night. And deep within the ship systems, an unseen presence watched, waiting for its next move. The night dragged on, each tick of the clock a reminder that whatever was happening, it was far from over. The crew, restless and wired, drifted from station to station like ghosts of their own, their minds heavy with sleep-deprived paranoia. Varel, unable to shake off the feeling of being watched by something with less than benevolent intentions, buried himself deeper in the ship systems. The anomalies persisted, a digital breadcrumb trail leading nowhere and everywhere. "Find anything?" Maylees asked, appearing by his side like a shadow with a penchant for snark. "Yeah," Varel replied, rubbing his eyes. "More questions and less sleep. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the other half are on fire." "Sounds cozy," Maylees replied, scanning the screens with the disdain of someone who once failed a math test. "Can we at least figure out what it wants, or is it just here for the ambience?" "If I had to guess," Varel mused, "it's curious, maybe even scared. Like a feral cat that's wandered into the ship and can't find its way out." "Great," Maylee sighed. "We're hosting a spectral feline. I'm allergic to cats." The bridge's lights dimmed briefly, a reminder that the ghostly presence wasn't just a figment of their imaginations. It skulked somewhere between the digital and the ethereal, leaving behind a trail of confusion and unease. For Arlies, the dreams were getting worse, morphing into vivid nightmares that lingered long after she'd woken up. She recounted one to Maylees, her voice hushed as if afraid speaking it aloud would make it real. "I was outside, floating in space. No suit, no nothing. Just me and the stars, and there was a voice, whispering." "Sounds like a blast," Maylees replied, trying to inject humor into the moment. "Did it at least tell you anything useful, like the meaning of life or next week's lottery numbers?" "Just coldness," Arlies whispered, shivering despite the warmth of the ship. It felt ancient. Maylees pondered this, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders like a particularly clingy ex. "Whatever it is, it's not happy. And it's making sure we know it." Their situation, already precarious, felt like it teetered on the edge of something much darker. The crew, each member plagued by dreams that were less dreamlike and more apocalyptic, grappled with their fraying sanity. "Can't we just leave?" Arlies suggested, half joking, half desperate. "Get out of Dodge before this place eats us alive." "Oh sure, just pack up and leave," Varel said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Except our dear guest here has done something clever with the engines. They're offline. And by offline, I mean good luck turning them on without a team of miracle workers." "Fantastic," Maylees muttered. stranded on a crystal nightmare with a clingy ghost. This mission is turning out to be a real vacation. As day bled into another restless night, the crew prepared for another bout of surreal dreams and unsettling whispers. Whatever lurked within the ship's systems, it was growing bolder, more insistent. And the crew, caught between the crystalline forest and their haunted vessel, could do little more than brace themselves for the storm to come. The next morning, or what passed for morning on the forsaken planet, brought little relief. Dark rings under eyes, frayed tempers, and an air of resigned dread hung over the crew like an unwelcome shroud. "Sleep well?" Maylis asked Arlies, the question less about courtesy and more about gauging just how much more madness they could endure. "Like a baby," Arlies deadpanned, "if babies had nightmares about being eaten by glowing trees." Veril, forever the picture of a man at the edge of a breakdown, sighed heavily. "I've been thinking—" "Careful, that sounds dangerous," Maylis interjected. "About the presence in the systems," Veril continued, ignoring her jab. I think it was human." That caught Maylis's attention, her eyes narrowing. "Explain." "I mean, at some point it was," Veril clarified. "This data trail, these anomalies, they're not random. They're like fingerprints, or echoes of someone who used to be here. Someone who liked to lurk in digital corners and freak out unsuspecting crews," Arlies ventured, her face a mask of skepticism. "Something like that," Veril nodded. "But it's more than just that. It's like it's stuck trying to reach out, communicate." "And what are we supposed to do?" Maylis asked, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and sympathy. "Invite it to tea and hope it spills the beans about its tragic backstory, maybe," Veril shrugged. "Or at least figure out how to coexist until we can get the engines back online. Assuming it doesn't just decide to ghost us entirely," Arlies added, humor laced with genuine concern. The crew, caught in the twilight between the digital and the real, found themselves facing a dilemma that was as peculiar as it was terrifying. With a ghost in their systems and an alien landscape outside, they were left with one option: to survive long enough to understand just what the hell they were dealing with. And in the cold, glowing shadows of Zephyra, understanding was as elusive as a good night's sleep. Veril leaned back in his chair, eyes bloodshot and hair doing an impeccable impression of a bird's nest after a particularly rough windstorm. He stared at the console, deep in the throes of what Arlies liked to call the madness phase, which was, coincidentally, the only phase Veril seemed to have. "Okay, I've got a plan," Veril announced, dragging his gaze away from the screen as if it were a particularly mesmerizing train wreck. Maylis raised an eyebrow, the universal sign of a captain who's heard one too many harebrained schemes. "This should be good." "Let's hear it." "We need to communicate with our ghost," Veril said, pointing at the data anomalies like they were cursed treasure. "And I think I've got a method." "Ever heard of dreamscaping?" "Dreamscaping," Arlies repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Sounds like some kind of sleep therapy for bored rich folks. More like tapping into our REM cycles to create a shared dream space," Veril explained, as if that cleared up anything. "If this presence is somehow connected to our dreams, we might be able to talk to it directly." Maylis let out a sigh that could have been used to inflate a hot air balloon. "So your genius plan is to have a chat with the spooky ghost thing in our collective nightmares." "Well, when you put it like that, it sounds a little ridiculous," Veril admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But it's the best shot we've got." "Best shot at what?" "Getting haunted to death," Arlies shot back, twirling her pencil as if hoping it would morph into a weapon of ghost destruction. "Look, we're stuck here anyway," Veril said, exasperation creeping into his voice. "And if it's trying to reach out, maybe we can figure out what it wants and get some answers. Or end up as the main course in some interstellar haunted house," Maylis said dryly, but she waved her hand in reluctant acquiescence. "Fine. Let's do it. But if I wake up dead, I'm haunting your ass, Veril." As the crew prepared for their unsanctioned dream mission, the ship's dim lighting added an appropriately eerie ambience. They gathered in the common area, where sleep pods lined the walls like a cramped, uncomfortable morgue. "All right, everybody," Veril said, doing his best to sound confident despite the fact that he was about to guide them into a shared nightmare. "Just relax, close your eyes, and think happy thoughts in this hellhole," Maylis muttered, climbing into her pod. "I'll try, but no promises." As one by one they succumbed to the sleep-inducing hum of the pods, Veril remained awake, inputting commands into the ship's interface to facilitate the shared dreamscape. A part of him wondered if he was making a huge mistake, but another part, the part that hadn't slept properly in days, didn't care. The transition into the dreamscape was jarring, like being tossed into ice-cold water. One moment they were in their pods, the next they stood in a warped version of the Endeavor's bridge. Everything was distorted, as if viewed through a funhouse mirror's drunken cousin. "Nice place," Maylis said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Very homey. Just a dream manifestation," Veril said, although he was mentally adding "I hope" to that sentence. "Let's focus on finding our guest of honor." As if on cue, the atmosphere shifted, an oppressive weight bearing down on them like the world's worst hangover. Before them appeared a figure, flickering and indistinct, like a hologram with a bad connection. Who are you?" Arlie stammered, her anxiety evident even in the dreamscape. The figure solidified, taking on the appearance of a woman clad in an outdated spacesuit. Her face was pale, drawn, as if she'd spent a lifetime in the dark. "I'm Tamsin," she said, her voice a ghostly whisper echoing across the void. "Tamsin," Maylis echoed, skepticism etched into her features. "And why, pray tell, are you haunting our ship?" Tamsin's expression was one of desperation, an emotion so raw it was almost tangible. "I was part of the original crew," she explained, her voice carrying the weight of years long past. "Something went wrong during a mission. The ship, it absorbed me." "Well, that explains the lovely hospitality," Maylis remarked, folding her arms. "Why stick around and spook the hell out of us? You could have just sent a nice polite message." "I've tried," Tamsin said, her voice tinged with frustration and sorrow. "But the ship, it's alive, and it's not alone. There's something else here, something dark. It's keeping me trapped, and now it's after you too. So, we've got a haunted ship possessed by evil forces," Arlie said, her tone wavering between incredulity and panic. "Great, just great, can we get rid of it?" Maylis asked, focusing on the pragmatic. "Or is this our new normal?" "I don't know," Tamsin admitted, her form flickering. "But I know how it started. There's a core deep in the ship. It's corrupted. If you can reach it, maybe you can stop this, and if we can't," Veril asked, more curious than afraid. Tamsin's eyes were hollow, haunted. "Then we all become part of the ship. Trapped forever." The oppressive weight of her words settled over them like a toxic fog. The implications were clear. They were standing on the edge of oblivion with only a ghost to guide them. "Well, that's a lovely thought to sleep on," Maylis said, her voice wry with dark humor. "All right, Tamsin. We'll do what we can. But if this all goes sideways, I'm blaming you." "Thank you," Tamsin said, her form beginning to fade. "I know it's a lot to ask, but you're my only hope. We'll figure it out," Veril assured her, though how much of it was bravado and how much was genuine belief was up for debate. As Tamsin vanished, the dreamscape began to unravel. They awoke with a jolt, the familiar confines of the Endeavor's common area a stark contrast to the surreal nightmare they'd just escaped. "Well, that was fun," Arlie said, her voice shaky as she climbed out of her pod. "Let's never do it again, okay?" Veril rubbed his temples as if trying to massage the nightmare away. "At least now we know what we're dealing with, do we?" Maylis asked, her tone sharp. "Because it sounds like we're in even deeper shit than we thought." "Yeah, but it's nice to have goals, right?" Veril replied with a mirthless grin. "Now we just have to find this core and figure out how to uncorrupt it, and avoid becoming part of the ship's haunted history," Arlie added, her face pale but determined. "Easy peasy," Maylis said, her sarcasm cutting through the thick tension like a knife. "All right, team. Let's get to work." With a renewed sense of purpose, however grim, the crew set about their task. The prospect of delving deeper into the belly of the haunted beast was hardly enticing, but the alternative was far worse. Their situation hadn't improved, but at least now they had a plan, even if that plan involved confronting the malevolent forces that had claimed their ship as its own. As the crew gathered their wits and prepared for the daunting task ahead, the crystalline forest outside pulsed ominously, a silent reminder of the danger that lurked both within and without. And amid the chaos, the ghostly presence of Tamsin lingered, a specter of hope in a world of shadows. Right, so, while we're on this cheery quest to avoid becoming ship furniture, Maylis began, surveying the common area with its dim lights and questionable hygiene, I guess it's only fair we find out how Tamsin ended up as a slightly more talkative ghost host. Verl scratched his head, a gesture so habitual it was practically his signature move. Best I can piece together, she was part of some big experimental mission back in the day. The details are murky, like trying to read fine print through a whiskey bottle, but it's all in the system logs somewhere. Yeah, somewhere being the operative word, Arliss chimed in, her fingers doing a nervous dance over the navigation console. And let me guess, we're gonna have to play hide and seek with the data to get the details. God, I love this job. Welcome to yet another day of How Screwed Are We, starring us, Maylis quipped, the sarcasm as rich as the cup of coffee she desperately needed. So, let's dig up some dirt on our ghostly friend. Verl nodded, diving into the console as if it held all the answers to the universe. Or at least the answers to why their lives had turned into a particularly grim episode of a space-themed soap opera. Here we go, he muttered, data scrolling by at a speed that would give anyone a headache. Tamsin was involved in a project called Project Ghostwalker. Sounds cozy, doesn't it? Because nothing ever goes wrong with projects named after spooky things, Arliss said, rolling her eyes so hard it was a wonder they didn't roll out of her head. Project Ghostwalker, Maylis repeated, letting the words sit on her tongue like a sigh or candy. And what exactly was the goal of this brilliant venture? Verl squinted at the lines of text, his face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. Some kind of consciousness transfer experiment. They were trying to link human minds directly with the ship's AI. Well, that's not terrifying at all, Arliss said, leaning back in her chair as if putting distance between herself and the monitor would somehow distance her from the insanity of their situation. And I suppose Tamsin got a little too chatty with the AI. More like she got stuck, Verl clarified, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if the very air around them might betray their secrets. The experiment went haywire, and instead of linking, she became part of the ship itself. Her consciousness trapped and mixed with the ship systems. That's just great, Maylis muttered, her sarcasm losing its edge as the reality of Tamsin's plight sank in. So, we're dealing with a haunted AI. And while I love a good horror story, I prefer mine with a little less personal involvement. And if Tamsin's trapped, Verl continued, chances are the ship's self-defense systems are just a tad overzealous because of it. Fantastic, Arliss groaned, resting her head in her hands, as if we didn't have enough on our plates. Let's just be careful, Maylis said, her tone laced with irony. Wouldn't want to wake the sleeping monster, right? With the knowledge that their ship was essentially a ghost with a superiority complex, the crew got to work. Verl, the mad scientist of the group, fiddled with the console, trying to locate the corrupted core Tamsin had mentioned. Arliss, the skeptic with a heart of gold, hovered nearby, ready to point out the flaws in any and all plans. And Maylis, the sarcastic captain, kept a watchful eye on everything, maintaining her role as the reluctant glue holding their motley crew together. The Endeavor's innards were a maze of dark corridors and clanging metal, every creak and groan a testament to its age and mysterious history. As they moved deeper into the ship, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker, as if the ship itself were watching them with malevolent interest. If I were a corrupted core, where would I hide? Maylis mused aloud, the question serving to break the heavy silence that had settled over them. Probably next to the self-destruct button, Arliss suggested, her voice echoing eerily in the narrow passage. "You know, just for dramatic effect." "Let's hope not," Verrill replied, his eyes darting between the path ahead and the schematics on his portable display. "But if we do accidentally trigger something, we'll need to be ready to run like hell." They reached a bulkhead sealed tighter than a miser's wallet, its surface etched with warnings in languages both familiar and alien. Verrill set to work on the controls, his fingers dancing across buttons and switches in a manner that suggested he was more comfortable with machines than people. "All right, I think I've got it," he declared, stepping back as the door hissed open with a sound like a sigh of relief from a tired beast. Beyond lay the heart of the ship, a chamber that pulsed with a dull, ominous light. In the center, a massive cylindrical structure stood, cables snaking from it like the tendrils of some mechanical kraken. It was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, a monument to humanity's hubris and ingenuity. "Well, there it is," Meili said, more to herself than anyone else. "The thing we've been searching for." "Now what?" "Now we try not to die," Verrill answered, his voice tinged with the dry humor that seemed to be the only thing keeping them sane. "We need to access the core's interface and see if we can uncorrupt it." "I'm guessing it's not as simple as turning it off and on again," Arliss quipped, although the anxiety in her voice betrayed her bravado. "Not quite," Verrill said, already moving towards the interface with the determined air of a man who was about to make a really big mistake. "But I might be able to isolate the corrupted section of the code and purge it. It's risky, though. The ship's self-defense mechanisms could activate." "More fun than a barrel of radioactive monkeys," Meili commented, taking a position to cover Verrill. "Let's just make sure we're not here when that happens." Verrill nodded, fingers flying across the interface as he began the delicate task of untangling the corrupted code from the ship's systems. Each line he deleted felt like defusing a bomb with a blindfold on, the tension in the air so thick it could have been cut with a spaceship hull cutter. As Verrill worked, a low rumble began to emanate from the chamber, the kind of sound that made your bones vibrate and your gut clench with primal fear. It was as if the ship itself was waking up, angered by their intrusion. Verrill," Arliss said, her voice cutting through the growing cacophony. "I think you might have pissed it off. I'm going as fast as I can." Verrill snapped back, perspiration beading on his forehead as he concentrated on the task at hand. Suddenly, the chamber was bathed in a harsh red light, alarms blaring with all the subtlety of a militaristic marching band on parade. The ship's self-defense mechanisms had activated, and the crew found themselves facing the very real possibility of becoming another ghostly tale. "Time to go," Meili shouted, grabbing Verrill by the collar and hauling him away from the console. "Move it." They sprinted for the exit, the ship's systems coming to life around them in a fury of flashing lights and automated warnings. Doors slammed shut in their wake, trying to cut off their escape, but the crew managed to slip through with seconds to spare. "Great plan, Verrill," Arliss yelled over the blaring alarms, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Really stellar work." "Not the time, Arliss," Verrill shot back, his voice strained as they raced down the corridor, the bulkheads closing behind them like a hungry mouth. Bursting through the final door and into the relative safety of the outer corridor, they skidded to a halt, breathing heavily as the alarms continued to wail in the distance. "Well," Meili said, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. "That could have gone better." "Could have gone worse too," Verrill replied, his face a mask of determination despite the near-death experience. "I got part of it done, but we'll have to go back and finish the job. Next time," Arliss said, still trying to catch her breath, "let's try not to wake the monster." "Deal," Verrill agreed, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "Until then," Meili said with a wry grin, "let's see if there's anything left in the liquor cabinet." "I think we've earned a drink." As they made their way back to the common area, the ship's alarms slowly died down, leaving them in an uneasy silence. Outside, the crystalline forest glowed with an unnerving intensity, a silent witness to the chaos that had unfolded within the Endeavor. They might have temporarily escaped the ship's wrath, but the battle was far from over. The crew knew they would have to return to face the haunted heart of their ship once more. But for now, they had a moment to breathe, to laugh in the face of the madness surrounding them, and to cling to the hope that they could still find a way to free Tamsin and themselves from the grip of the ghost ship. And if that meant dodging a few more death traps along the way, well, so be it. After all, what's a little danger in the grand scheme of things? To surviving the day, Maylis toasted, raising a glass of something that smelled suspiciously like engine degreaser. To not becoming part of the furniture, Arlies added, clinking her makeshift tumbler against Maylis's. And to getting some answers, Verrill concluded, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. Even if they do lead us straight to hell. With that, they drank, the warmth of the liquid a small comfort against the cold uncertainty of their future. The common area's dim light flickered like a bad omen, casting eerie shadows across the dubious hygiene of its surfaces. Maylis, with a glass of questionable liquid still in hand, slumped back into an equally questionable chair. It creaked in a way that suggested it was one personal vendetta away from collapsing. "So, what's the plan, fearless leader?" Arlies asked, her tone as dry as the dust bunnies under the console. Verrill, still sweating from their near miss with the ship's self-defense systems, leaned against the bulkhead, running a hand through his hair. "We need a new strategy," he muttered. "A smarter approach. Smarter than running headfirst into the ship's angry maw." "Color me shocked," Maylis replied, wincing as she shifted in her seat. The strain of their earlier escape had left her with a sharp pain in her side, a grim reminder that the Endeavor was not a fan of uninvited guests in its more secretive depths. "Are you okay?" Arlies asked, her voice tinged with genuine concern, a rare break from her usual sarcasm. "Just peachy," Maylis lied, taking another sip of the engine degreaser-turned liquor. "Nothing like a bit of internal bleeding to spice up your day." "Great, now all we need is a dance number to really complete the show," Verrill quipped, though his expression was far from amused. His eyes had the distant look of someone who was piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. "I've been thinking, we might have a way to outmaneuver the ship." "Do tell," Maylis encouraged, shifting again and regretting it immediately. The pain in her side flared up like a particularly unpleasant fireworks display. "The ship's systems are more advanced than anything we've dealt with," Verrill explained, "but they are still systems. They have rules, logic. If we can manipulate the shared dreamscape, we might be able to confuse the AI long enough to access the core." "Dreamscape? You mean our nightly horror show?" Arlies shuddered. "Not exactly Disneyland." "I'm aware it's risky, but it's also our best shot," Verrill insisted, scratching his head as if hoping the motion would dislodge some hidden genius. "And how do we do that without ending up ghost number 2? Arlies asked, glancing uneasily at the walls, as if expecting them to sprout faces and start offering unsolicited advice. Verrill took a deep breath, the kind that promised bad news. "We need to deliberately trigger a dreamscape session, but with an anchor to pull us back. I can set up a program that links our consciousness to the navigation console." "Wait, you're suggesting we dive into a shared dream with a haunted AI and hope we don't end up brain dead?" Maylis said, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "I've heard worse plans, but not by much." "It's not without risk, but it's a calculated risk," Verrill insisted, determination hardening his features. "Calculated risk," Arlies repeated slowly. "You know, that's just a fancy way of saying we're probably screwed, but we'll look smart doing it." Maylis sighed, the weight of leadership pressing down on her like a particularly unwelcome gravity well. "All right, let's say we go along with this. What's the worst that could happen?" Verrill hesitated, eyes dropping to the floor. "The ship could trap us in the dreamscape, or worse, sever our connections entirely." "Fantastic," Arlies said, sarcasm dialed to 11. "Certain death or eternal nightmare, truly a menu of delightful options." Maylis rubbed her temples, feeling the beginnings of a headache that would probably outlive her. But if we pull this off, we might have a fighting chance, right? Exactly, Veril nodded, his voice carrying a rare note of hope, albeit the kind you'd find at a flea market, dented and scratched but still functional. Then we do it, Maylis decided, forcing herself to her feet despite the protest from her aching side. We need to prep, and I need to find something stronger than this swill to numb this damn pain. The crew dispersed, each lost in their own thoughts of impending doom. Arlie's headed for the navigation console, while Veril set about programming their dreamscape anchor, occasionally muttering to himself like the mad scientist he was rapidly becoming. Maylis took a moment to herself, leaning heavily against a bulkhead. The metallic surface was cool against her forehead, a tiny reprieve from the chaos swirling around them. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability before the familiar cloak of sarcasm and leadership fell back into place. "Hey," she heard Arlie's voice from behind her. "You sure you're up for this? You look like hell." Maylis chuckled, a sound that was more wry than joyful. "I think hell's been using me as a punching bag for a while now, but yeah, I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Just don't go getting yourself killed, okay?" Arlie's added, her usual bravado struggling against the genuine concern beneath. "No promises," Maylis replied, straightening up with a wince. "But I'll do my best." Together they returned to the common area, where Veril had rigged up a makeshift command center, wires snaking out of the console like tentacles from a particularly disorganized squid. "Everything set?" Maylis asked, surveying the setup with a critical eye. "Ready as it can be," Veril confirmed, though his voice suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'll initiate the dreamscape, then we all need to focus on staying connected. It'll be like a tug-of-war, but with our minds." "And if we lose?" Arlie's asked, though she already knew the answer. "If we lose, we won't know it," Veril said flatly. "We'll just stay trapped in the dreamscape. Forever." "No pressure then," Maylis said, taking a deep breath and letting it out slowly. "Let's get this over with." They took their positions around the console, each connecting their own neural links, the familiar cold bite of metal against skin, a stark reminder of the stakes. Veril tapped a few keys, and the console hummed to life, a low, ominous sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath them. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, initiating the sequence with the measured calm of a man accepting his own execution. The world around them wavered, reality folding in on itself like a badly constructed piece of origami. Colors bled into one another, and the familiar confines of the ship melted away, replaced by the surreal landscape of their collective dreamscape. They stood in an endless expanse, a vast, empty void that seemed to stretch into eternity. The ground beneath their feet was a shifting mosaic of memories and fears, a reflection of the chaos within their own minds. "Well, this is cozy," Maylis said, her voice echoing in the strange, dreamlike atmosphere. "Where's the welcome committee?" "Probably sharpening the knives," Arlie suggested, glancing around with a wary eye. "Stay focused," Veril warned. "We need to find the core representation. It should be around here somewhere." They moved through the dreamscape, each step sending ripples through the fabric of the illusion. It was a place without logic, where the impossible was mundane and the mundane was terrifying. "Over there," Maylis pointed, spotting a distant structure rising from the chaos like a jagged mountain. "That looks promising, in a here be dragons kind of way." They approached the structure, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the dreamscape itself was trying to hold them back. The air was thick with tension, a palpable sense of dread that gnawed at their resolve. As they drew closer, the structure resolved into a monolithic tower, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. It was a thing of nightmares, a testament to the ship's malevolent intelligence. "This is it," Veril said, his voice barely a whisper. "The core of the ship's AI." "Great," Maylis said, eyeing the tower with suspicion. "Now what? Ring the doorbell and hope it invites us in for tea." "We need to focus on destabilizing the core's defenses," Veril explained, his eyes fixed on the tower. Imagine it as something less threatening, something we can overcome. Like a giant marshmallow, Arlie suggested, trying to inject some levity into the oppressive atmosphere. Exactly, Verrill nodded, though his expression was grim. We need to visualize it as something we can destroy. They concentrated, their minds working in unison to reshape the dreamscape. The tower wavered, its surface melting and reforming as their combined will surged against it. Slowly, the structure began to change, its edges softening, its height shrinking until it resembled nothing more than a large, quivering mound of gelatin. "Well, that's one way to topple a nightmare," Maylie said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Don't celebrate just yet," Verrill warned. "We still need to dismantle it." As they focused on tearing down the gelatinous structure, the dreamscape seemed to fight back, shadows coalescing into nightmarish forms, creatures born of fear and doubt. "We're not alone," Arlies warned, her voice tight with tension as the shadows circled, their features indistinct and menacing. "Keep going," Maylies urged, her voice steady despite the rising fear. "We can't let it win." Together they pushed against the dreamscape's defenses, their minds locked in a battle of wills against the ship's AI. The shadowy forms lunged, but the crew held their ground, refusing to yield. Finally, with a shuddering collapse, the mound of gelatin dissolved into nothingness, the dreamscape unraveling around them like a torn tapestry. They awoke in the common area, gasping for breath, the neural links releasing them with a hiss of escaping air. "Did it work?" Arlies asked, her voice hoarse from exertion. Verrill checked the console, his eyes scanning the readouts with an intensity that bordered on madness. "I think so," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. "We've destabilized the core's defenses." "So we won?" Maylies asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion and relief. "Not quite," Verrill said, his tone dropping with the weight of reality. "We've made progress, but the fight's not over yet." "Then we rest," Maylies declared, her voice firm despite the fatigue lacing her words. "We'll need all our strength for what comes next." They settled back into the common area, the weight of their actions hanging over them like a storm cloud. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Yet, in that moment of quiet, with the ship's systems temporarily subdued, they allowed themselves a flicker of hope. And in the grimdark expanse of space, sometimes a flicker was all you needed. The air in the common area was thick with the scent of burnt circuits and sweat. Verrill was sprawled beneath the console, arms swimming through a tangled mess of wires. He looked like a drunken octopus trying to knit a sweater. "This plan better work, Verrill," Maylies grumbled, leaning against the wall with all the enthusiasm of a cat being dragged to a bath. "Or I'm holding you personally responsible for my future as a vegetable." "Don't worry, Cap," Verrill's voice drifted out, muffled by the console. "If it doesn't work, you'll be too busy being dead to blame me." Maylies snorted. "Always the optimist, aren't you?" "Hey, somebody's got to be," Verrill retorted, popping his head out with a grin that spoke more of insanity than confidence. He wiped his greasy hands on his pants, leaving streaks that looked suspiciously like the fingerprints of regret. Arlies was at the navigation console, her fingers flicking through system logs like she was searching for the last tin of beans in a post-apocalyptic grocery store. Her eyes were dark and tired, but her sarcasm was as sharp as ever. "You know, for a supposed state-of-the-art ship, the Endeavor sure seems eager to kill us." Maylies chuckled dryly. "Maybe it heard we were planning to replace it with a newer model." "Yeah, I can see how that might sting a bit," Arlies replied, rolling her eyes. "Nothing like a little existential crisis to keep the AI on its toes." "Enough chit-chat," Verrill interrupted, straightening up with a handful of dubious-looking components. "We've got a dreamscape to crash." Maylies pushed herself off the wall, her body protesting every movement. "All right then, let's get this over with. I've got a date with Oblivion, and she's getting impatient." The crew gathered around the console, each taking their place like reluctant actors in a play directed by a particularly malicious god. Maylies settled into her chair, feeling the cool bite of the neural link against her neck. It was a sensation she was starting to associate with bad decisions and worse outcomes. "Remember," Veril said, his voice carrying the solemnity of a preacher at a funeral, "we need to stay focused on the core's representation. It's the only way to break through." "Focus," Arlie said with a snort. "Right, like herding cats in a laser pointer factory. Think of it as a really high-stakes game of capture the flag," Maylie suggested, her tone laced with irony. "Except if we lose, we get trapped in a nightmare forever. No pressure." "Exactly," Veril nodded, ignoring the sarcasm. "We've got one shot at this. Let's make it count." With a collective breath that tasted of desperation and resignation, they initiated the sequence. The familiar world of the Endeavor melted away, replaced by the swirling chaos of the dreamscape. It was like stepping into a Salvador Dali painting after a few too many shots of reality distortion juice. They stood once more in the endless expanse, a realm where logic took a vacation and brought back a souvenir of madness. The ground shifted beneath their feet, a patchwork of memories and guilt stitched together by the trembling hands of their subconscious minds. "Feels like déjà vu all over again," Maylie muttered, eyeing the surreal landscape with suspicion. "Well, if it isn't our favorite death trap," Arlie said, gesturing to the distant jagged tower that loomed like a particularly bad mood. "Think this time we can turn it into something more fun. Like a bouncy castle or a giant margarita. Focus, remember," Veril chided, though his face bore the weary look of a man already late for his own funeral. "We need to destabilize it again." They trudged toward the tower, each step a battle against the dreamscape's insidious pull. It was like wading through molasses, a sticky, cloying resistance that tried to drag them down into the depths of their own fears. "Lovely place you've brought us to, Veril," Maylie remarked, her tone as dry as a desert in July. "Really makes you appreciate the comforts of home, like airlocks and homicidal AI. "It's a work in progress," Veril replied with a shrug. "Besides, nothing says team-building exercise like facing the embodiment of your insecurities." "Great," Arlie muttered. "Maybe next we can have a trust fall with the ship's AI." The tower loomed above them, an unholy amalgamation of nightmares made manifest. It was a monument to the ship's intelligence, an edifice that spoke of malice and control. "This is the part where we turn it into jelly again, right?" Maylie asked, more to break the oppressive silence than anything. "That's the plan," Veril confirmed, though he sounded about as confident as a snowball in a supernova. "We need to concentrate and reshape it, make it harmless." "Easy peasy," Arlie drawled. "Just like brain surgery with a hangover." With a collective effort, they focused their minds on the tower, channeling their will into reshaping the dreamscape. The tower rippled, its surface bubbling and shifting as their intentions pressed against it. Slowly, painstakingly, the structure began to change, its once menacing form softening into something altogether less terrifying. It wobbled, gelatinous and absurd, a mockery of its former self. "A masterpiece," Maylie declared, her voice laced with mock grandeur. "Michelangelo would be proud." "Don't get too comfortable," Veril warned. "We still have to dismantle it." As they worked to unravel the tower's defenses, the dreamscape responded with predictable hostility. Shadows coalesced around them, dark shapes that moved with a predatory grace. "Looks like we have company," Arlie said, her voice tight with the kind of grim humor that thrived in the face of certain doom. "Nice to know we're popular. Just keep moving," Maylie urged, her focus unwavering despite the encroaching threat. "We've got to keep pushing until it breaks." In a dance of desperation and determination, they fought against the dreamscape's defenses, their every move a struggle against the oppressive weight of fear. The shadows lunged, but the crew held their ground, refusing to give an inch. Finally, with a shudder that reverberated through the dreamscape like the dying breath of a vanquished beast, the gelatinous tower collapsed. Its structure dissolved into nothingness, the dreamscape unraveling with a sigh of defeat. They awoke gasping in the common area, the neural links hissing as they released their grip. The reality of the Endeavor was a welcome balm, even with its flickering lights and dubious hygiene. "Did we do it?" Arliss croaked, her voice hoarse from the effort. Verrill cast a weary gaze over the console, his eyes tracing the readouts like a man searching for absolution. "We've breached the Corps' defenses," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief and exhaustion. "But the system's still fighting." "Of course it is," Mealy said, letting out a breath that was more a sigh of exasperation than relief. "Why would anything be easy? We've made progress," Verrill insisted, though the words carried the weight of a man too tired to lie convincingly. "But we've got a long way to go." "Then we rest," Mealy declared, her tone brooking no argument. "We'll need all the strength we can muster for the next round." They collapsed into the battered chairs of the common area, the silence around them a fragile thing, delicate and precious. In that moment, surrounded by the familiar hum of the ship, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet, a brief respite from the madness. "Next time," Arliss said, breaking the silence with her characteristic irreverence, "let's just take up knitting or something. Fewer life-or-death scenarios." "Knitting," Mealy repeated, the idea turning over in her mind like a particularly stubborn rock. "You know, that doesn't sound half bad. Until someone accidentally strangles themselves with yarn," Verrill added, the dark humor cutting through the tension like a well-placed knife. "Details," Arliss replied, waving a hand dismissively. "For now, let's just focus on surviving." They sat together in companionable silence, the weight of the journey ahead pressing down on them like a storm cloud. Yet in that moment, with the ship's systems temporarily subdued, they allowed themselves a flicker of hope. And in the grimdark expanse of space, sometimes a flicker was all you needed. The crew sat in the common area, faces as blank as a politician's promises, staring at each other like they'd just survived a particularly vicious karaoke night. Captain Mealy's, leaning against the wall, looked like she was mentally drafting her resignation. Arliss, ever the optimist, was busy pretending the world hadn't just tried to end while she ran a hand through her hair, which somehow managed to look both unkempt and defeated. Verrill, the man who made sure things broke slightly less frequently, was hunched over a console, fingers tapping keys like they owed him money. His eyes darted between the screen and the crew, his expression a blend of annoyance and resignation. "All right, folks," he said, finally pulling his gaze away from the readout. "We've got a new plan and you're going to hate it." "That's the spirit," Mealy quipped, raising an eyebrow. "Nothing like starting a motivational speech with a warning." "Look," Verrill continued, "the dreamscape's still our best shot at freeing Tamsin's consciousness. But we need to disable the ship's defenses first, which means tinkering with its core commands. And how exactly do we do that without getting fried?" Arliss asked, her tone sharper than her usual sarcasm, tinged with genuine curiosity, or maybe just morbid curiosity. Verrill gestured to the tangled mess of cables and components strewn about the room. "By going back in. We've got to destabilize the ship's control matrix from the inside." "So, same nightmare, different day," Arliss shot back, folding her arms across her chest. "Sounds charming." Mealy nodded, the weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders like a particularly vengeful ex. "All right, let's get this over with. If I'm going to die today, I'd rather not do it sober." With a collective groan that could only be described as existential, the crew donned their neural links. The familiar pressure on Mealy's neck reminded her of both its icy bite and her questionable life choices. The world around them dissolved once more, the Endeavor's utilitarian confines replaced by the chaotic expanse of the dreamscape. It was as if Salvador Dali had taken up interior decorating, and the result was predictably unsettling. "This place never gets any easier on the eyes," Arliss muttered as she surveyed the surreal landscape. "Or the brain." A shadowy mass in the distance marked the presence of the ship's core defenses, a swirling vortex of malice and mischief, like a cat with a vendetta. Mealy squared her shoulders and started toward it, forcing confidence into her voice. "Let's give this bastard a run for its money." Verrill, looking more like a man resigned to his fate than a hero on a quest, followed close behind. Just remember, the goal is to make it think it's losing control. We confuse it enough we might just get Tamsin out. The path to the vortex was treacherous, the dreamscape shifting beneath their feet with all the stability of a politician's promise. Every step brought them closer to the core's beating heart, a blackened mass of tangled code and resentment. Arlie snorted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Great. We're going to die, and for what? A ghost with commitment issues and a homicidal AI that thinks it's Picasso. Focus, Maylie snapped, though there was no real heat to her words, just determination tempered by desperation. We're doing this for Tamsin, and you know to not die. As they approached the vortex, a wave of distortion crashed over them, as if reality itself had decided to take a sick day. Images flickered in the air, memories, fears, regrets, all vying for attention like a particularly dysfunctional family reunion. All right, it's showtime, Veril announced, his voice overshadowed by the ominous hum of the vortex. We need to destabilize it, make it doubt itself. And how do we do that? Arlies asked, her tone more curious than concerned. Start questioning its life choices. Something like that, Veril replied, a wry grin tugging at his lips. We need to introduce some chaos. A little anarchy in its code should do the trick. Maylies raised an eyebrow. Anarchy, huh? I knew I kept you around for a reason. They focused their minds, channeling every ounce of defiance and frustration into the core's defenses. The air shimmered with the force of their combined will, a storm of confusion and dissent. The vortex writhed under the assault, its form fracturing and reforming like a digital Jekyll and Hyde. It was a dance of chaos, a battle of wills that left no room for doubt or hesitation. Keep it up, Veril shouted above the cacophony. We're almost there. The shadows pressed closer, the dreamscape fighting back with every trick it had. But the crew held firm, their determination unwavering in the face of adversity. And then, with a shudder that sent ripples through the very fabric of the dreamscape, the vortex imploded, its defenses collapsing in on themselves with a sigh of defeat. They stood in the aftermath, the silence almost deafening in its completeness. The dreamscape had lost its grip, its malevolent influence finally fractured. Is it done? Arlies asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Veril nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. The defenses are down. We've got a window to free Tamsin. Then let's not waste it, Maylies urged, her resolve renewed by the taste of victory on her tongue. We've come this far, no turning back now. They moved as one toward the heart of the dreamscape, each step a testament to their determination. The path was clearer now, the landscape less hostile, as if the dreamscape itself had finally accepted its defeat. At the center of it all lay Tamsin, her presence a ghostly echo in the digital ether. She shimmered with a faint light, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. Tamsin, Maylies called out, reaching for her with a hand that trembled with both fear and hope. It's time to come home. The ghostly figure turned, her expression one of relief and gratitude. You did it, she whispered, her voice a soft breeze against their minds. You actually did it. Yeah, well, Veril replied, his grin as weary as it was triumphant. We figured we owed you one. As they reached out to Tamsin, the dreamscape began to dissolve, the digital world unraveling like a tapestry of forgotten nightmares. The crew clung to one another, their minds linked by a shared victory. And then, with a rush of sensation that left them breathless, they awoke in the common area once more. The neural links hissed as they disconnected, releasing their hold with a finality that was almost anticlimactic. Is she? Arlie started, glancing around the room as if expecting to see Tamsin materialize out of thin air. Maylie shook her head, but her expression was one of satisfaction. She's free, her consciousness is safe. A ripple of relief swept through the room, the tension finally breaking like a dam under pressure. It was over. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd won. Well, Veril said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and elation. That wasn't so bad, was it? Arlies rolled her eyes, but the relief in her voice was undeniable. Speak for yourself. Next time I'm voting for the knitting club. Maylies chuckled, the sound as welcome as a sunbeam after a storm. We'll see. For now, let's just enjoy the moment." They sank into the battered chairs, the weight of their journey finally lifting from their shoulders. It was a hard-won victory, but a victory nonetheless. And in the vast, unforgiving expanse of space, that was more than enough. As they sat in companionable silence, the ship systems hummed softly around them, a gentle reminder of the world they'd saved. The threat was gone, the danger past. For once they could breathe easy. "Next stop," Maylis announced, her tone light with newfound hope, "anywhere but here." With a chorus of weary laughter, the crew nodded in agreement. The galaxy awaited, full of possibilities and perils both. But for now, they were content to rest, secure in the knowledge that they had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And in the grimdark corners of the universe, sometimes that was more than anyone could ask for. Captain Maylis leaned back in her chair, the neural links discarded like yesterday's bad decisions. The common area was finally quiet, save for the faint buzz of the ship systems, which was a welcome change from the usual symphony of chaos. "If I never see another dreamscape again, it'll be too soon," she muttered, glancing at Veril, who was nursing a cup of something that might have once been coffee. "That's the spirit, Captain," Veril replied, managing a grin. "Nothing says job well done like PTSD." Arliss plopped down next to them, her hair still managing to defy gravity in a way that made Maylis question the laws of physics. "So, what's next? Do we get medals, or do we just quietly drink ourselves into oblivion?" "Oblivion sounds about right," Maylis said with a chuckle. "But before we get too comfortable, we should probably make sure the ship isn't planning any more murder sprees." Veril nodded, setting down his mug with a sigh that spoke volumes about his desire for a nap. "Well, the ship's AI has taken a backseat for now, but I'll need to go through the logs. Make sure there's nothing lurking in the code waiting to bite us in the ass." "Great," Arliss said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "So more time in front of screens. Remind me why we left planetside again." "Because crystal trees are not as fun as they sound," Maylis replied. "And because some of us are masochists." Veril stood, stretching his back with a grimace. "I'll need Arliss to help with navigation recalibrations. Maylis, maybe check the supply logs. Make sure our next meal doesn't involve anything that was recently sentient." Arliss feigned a salute. Aye, boss. You can count on me to not crash us into another planet." "Comforting," Maylis said dryly. "Let's get to it then. The sooner we make sure this ship's not about to implode, the sooner we can move on to more pressing matters, like drinking." With that, they dispersed, each to their own tasks. Maylis headed toward the storage hold, her mind wandering as she walked. The weight of command felt a little lighter now, though she still considered the merits of a career change. Maybe something less violent, like interstellar knitting. But it was hard to deny the rush that came from surviving yet another insane ordeal. The storage hold was a mess, as usual. Boxes and containers were stacked haphazardly, the aftermath of their rapid departure and everything that followed. Maylis dug through the logs, checking for anything that seemed off. Alien snacks, sentient soup cans, anything was possible at this point. Meanwhile, Veril was elbow-deep in wires, the console before him a tangled web of circuits and controls. His brow furrowed in concentration. He sifted through the ship system logs, searching for anomalies like a miner panning for gold, or in this case, nightmares. Arliss, true to her word, was busy at the navigation console, her fingers flying over keys with practiced ease. Every so often, she'd mutter something under her breath, no doubt sharing her opinions with the universe at large. "Hey, Veril," she called over, not bothering to look up from her work. "Think we'll ever get hazard pay for this gig, or is it just implied in the job description?" Veril's response was a non-committal grunt, his focus on the screen before him. "Probably the latter. We signed up for this, remember?" "Right," Arliss said, rolling her eyes. "Because self-inflicted torture is everyone's dream career." "Hey, some people pay good money for this kind of experience," Veril shot back. "We just get to live it for free." Maylis finally returned, a triumphant look on her face. "Well, good news. We're not out of rations yet and nothing's tried to eat me. I'd call that a win. Small victories, Veril said, pushing aside the jumble of cables. Speaking of which, I've got good and bad news. Bad news is there's still some residual code from our dear departed AI friend. Good news, it's dormant for now. And Tamsin, Maylis asked, forcing a casual tone. The thought of losing her still hung heavy, a shadow that refused to dissipate. We managed to quarantine her consciousness, Veril replied. It's stable, but we'll need to find a more permanent solution. Can't have her ghosting around the system forever. Arlie snorted at the unintentional pun. Guess she's haunting more than just our dreams now. With the pressing matters more or less under control, the crew finally allowed themselves a moment of relaxation. The tension in the room eased, each of them silently acknowledging how close they'd come to disaster. So, what's the lesson here? Maylis asked, looking around at her crew. Besides the fact that we should all consider therapy. Never trust an AI with a god complex, Arlie suggested, leaning back in her chair. Or crystal trees, Veril added, rubbing at his temples. Seriously, who thought landing there was a good idea? Maylis chuckled, shaking her head. Well, I guess we learned a thing or two about sticking together. Literally. And metaphorically. The camaraderie in the room was palpable, the bonds forged in the crucible of shared insanity. They'd faced their fears, challenged the unknown, and come out the other side, bruised, battered, but alive. What now? Arlie asked, casting a speculative glance at Veril. Do we get to keep this haunted ship, or do we trade it in for something less homicidal? Veril grinned, the expression easing some of his weariness. Depends if we can find a buyer. I hear haunted ships are all the rage these days. And where do we go from here? Maylis wondered aloud. Back to civilization, or do we keep tempting fate? Arlie shrugged, a mischievous glint in her eye. I say we keep going. We've proven we're pretty good at not dying. I agree, Veril said. And besides, who else is going to keep the galaxy interesting? With their decision made, Maylis felt a renewed sense of purpose. The galaxy was vast, full of wonders and horrors both. They'd faced down one of the darkest chapters and come out the other side. Whatever lay ahead, they'd meet it together, armed with experience and a healthy dose of skepticism. As they settled into their tasks, a sense of normalcy, or what passed for it, began to return. Repairs were underway, systems checked and double-checked. The ship hummed with a familiar rhythm, a reminder of their shared purpose. The common area became their haven, a place of rest and reflection. They swapped stories, shared jibes, and laughed, a sound that echoed through the corridors, banishing the shadows that had lingered too long. Maylis watched her crew, a small smile playing on her lips. They'd come a long way, faced challenges that had pushed them to the brink, but they'd also grown, learned to rely on one another in ways they hadn't imagined. Here's to surviving, Maylis said, raising an imaginary glass. And to whatever madness comes next. The others raised their hands in a toast, their laughter a balm for weary souls. They were a team, a family forged in the fires of chaos and adversity. As they sat together, the darkness held at bay by the brightness of their camaraderie, they knew they'd face whatever came next with the same determination and irreverence that had carried them this far. In the vastness of space, where uncertainty reigned supreme, they found solace in the one constant they could count on, each other. And that, Maylis mused, was a reason to keep going, no matter how grim the universe might be. The Endeavor may have been a haunted, malicious piece of technology, but it was their haunted, malicious piece of technology. A home among the stars, filled with the kind of memories that only near-death experiences could create. With a final, shared look, the crew returned to their tasks. The galaxy awaited, full of unexplored wonders and untold dangers. But for now, they were content. Content to be alive together and ready for whatever madness lay ahead. And in the grimdark expanse of the universe, that was something worth holding onto.